is because the original article was written in 1991, and that's 20 years. So there's kind of a 20-year anniversary here. But actually, I think the timing is not just the 20th anniversary. I think this whole question of American competitiveness and the role of regulation in American competitiveness is really risen again to the top, or very near the top of the radar screen in the debate in this country. At the same time, there's a tremendous angst and even tension between business and government, between the private sector and the public sector, and how those two parties can either work collaboratively or work competitively in addressing some of the most important challenges facing America and our society. So I think this question of this hypothesis is in a sense an issue that won't quit, and it's also a metaphor, as we'll see later, for a lot of other issues and how we are tackling those issues from a governmental and policy point of view. So what I'd like to do very briefly in this session, and hopefully not take too much time, is really cover really 4 topics. One, I think you might be interested, because I think it will be somewhat educational for today's issues, for you to understand kind of how this hypothesis emerged. You know, why would I be crazy enough to put out this idea? I am a card-carrying economist. I have a PhD from Harvard in economics. You know, how could I possibly have put out this idea? Where did it come from? And I think the answer is that it came from a number of threads and bodies of thinking and research that I think were quite different from kind of the mainstream work that was going on in economics that had led people to conclude the opposite of the hypothesis. And I think going through that, I think, will be helpful because it lays some important groundwork I think that we can build upon. Secondly, I'd like to reflect a little bit on what's changed, you know, since the original article was written. But I can be very brief there because I think both Mark and Stuart have done a good job of kind of capturing a little bit of the empirical evidence and what's happened since. So we'll make that brief. I'd like to just summarize some of the implications that this body of work has today for the way we're thinking about regulation and in general, and for the way we're thinking about environmental regulation. And there I'd like to use, in addition to some general principles, a case study. Dan Esty and I have written an op-ed, which hopefully will appear shortly, about climate change and how we think about regulation in the area of climate change. And we've had kind of a checkered history there in America over the last few years. The question is, if we applied the thinking in this work, and thinking, by the way, that Dan and I have written about over the subsequent years, how would we approach the regulation around the issue of climate change? And I think it's a very telling and a very immediate example of how perhaps we could have done this better if we could have a more broad consensus about this basic approach. But then, if we have time, and I'll calibrate the time as we get there, I'd also like to suggest that this Porter hypothesis, this basic idea that addressing a societal issue in the right way, with the right regulatory environment, can actually enhance competitiveness of the company. How this basic issue can actually be applied to many, many more societal issues. Because since I wrote this little paper, I've worked on a whole variety of other topics, like health, like healthcare, like safety, like economically distressed communities. And what comes to the fore time and time again is some of the same underlying principles. And out of that conviction and out of that body of work has come another article, which you hopefully will pick up, called Creating Shared Value, which is in the current issue of the Harvard Business Review. I think copies are available to pick up if anybody's interested, which talks a little bit about how the same philosophy embedded in the Porter hypothesis really applies to all manner of the corporation's impacts or touch points with society. And perhaps I'd like to give you some of the highlights of that thought. And then, of course, we'll have time for hopefully some discussion. So where did the border hypothesis emerge? Well, first and foremost, it emerged from an empirical observation. I had written, after an arduous 5-year process, a book called The Competitive Advantage of Nations. And in that book, I had looked at 10 major industrial countries from every continent or many continents. And I'd really been trying to get at the question of why are some countries competitive in certain fields? Why is America so dominant in software? Why are the Japanese so phenomenally strong in consumer electronics? Why are the Germans so good in machinery and automobiles? What explains really the origins of competitiveness? Where we understood that to really understand competitiveness, we couldn't look at the nation as a whole. We had to, if we really wanted to understand competitiveness, we had to look at the specific fields within the nation in which the nation had emerged and become really an innovator and a leader. And in the course of writing that book, I'd looked at hundreds of different industries across many, many different countries. And I kept noticing something. I kept noticing that there was often very strict standards and regulation in a particular country, in a particular field, but yet that country was competitive in that field. I kept noticing that over and over again. And so out of that came this notion that we could see not a conflict between environmental regulation, strict environmental regulation, and competitiveness, but we could actually see a complementarity, that these things could actually reinforce each other. But what became clear from looking at all this country experience was that there was a critical piece to make that connection work, and that was designing the regulation, the regulatory process, and the regulatory standards themselves in the right way. And the right way meant really stimulating innovation rather than simply imposing cost that the firm could do nothing but bear. And it was that empirical observation that kind of led to this hypothesis. This article was solicited by the editor of Scientific American, who had read the book and had noticed this observation that had been made a number of times in the book and said, gee, would you write a little article on it? So this turned into a 1-page article. And little did I know that here we would be today. But I'm extremely proud of this work, and I'm also extremely proud of the literature that's grown out of that article, because as I hope you picked up from Mark's summary, this is a literature that's focused on the facts, it's focused on empirical evidence, and the nuance and the richness of the understanding of the issues and the theory has simply grown and grown and grown over time. And if more of the research in economics was like this, we'd be a lot better off. Because it's targeted at real issues, it's dealing with very practical, on-the-ground problems of great importance for our society. So I'm very proud of this literature that grew out of this work. Now, why might I have taken those empirical observations seriously? Why might I believe that every firm wasn't optimizing its environmental performance already? Because that was what the theory said. Why might I believe that innovation in the use of resources and minimizing environmental impacts might actually enhance competitiveness? Why might I think that the regulatory environment could be a profound driver of innovation? Well, all these things were coming at me from a body of work that I had been doing over a number of years. And so let's just talk about some of the key points.